engage with local communities.
Thank you very much. That now ends general questions and brings us to First Minister's questions as the next item of business. Question number 1, Joanne Lamont.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what engagements he has planned for the rest of the day.
First Minister.
Later today I will be having meetings to take forward the Government's programme for Scotland. Thank
you. Joanne Lamont.
Thank you. Is the only place in Scotland which won't benefit from independence Aberdeen Donside? And is that why neither the First Minister nor his candidate are mentioning the I word there?
First Minister.
I have to say the Labour Party, which fought a by-election in Glasgow North East under the campaign issue that the SNP were neglecting Glasgow and giving lots of money to Aberdeen, is now fighting desperately to try and defend their appalling track record in the City Administration of Aberdeen by suggesting that the SNP are giving money to Glasgow and not to Aberdeen. If only the internet hadn't been invented, this Labour campaign might have been successful.
Joanne Lamont.
Yes, but the First Minister isn't talking about independence in Aberdeen, although he spends all of his life talking about it everywhere else. And of course, isn't it the case?
Order.
The First Minister isn't mentioning independence in Aberdeen because his case is falling apart. His economic advisers, with or without Nobel Prizes, say it's rubbish. Joe Stiglitz says his corporation tax policy won't work. And Jim and Margaret Cuthbert say his idea of independence isn't independence at all. John Swinney is exiled for saying in private,
Order.
Well,
Order.
We live in hope.
Order.
We live in hope that John Swinney will say in public what he said to his Cabinet colleagues in private. Because if we remember, he said that an independent Scotland might not be able to afford the state pension, and in public, he did say it. He didn't say it to you, but he did say it.
Order. Order.
Said,
through the chair, please.
In public, the SNP can't say what currency it would be paid in if we had one. Isn't it the case that independence is the First Minister's passion, but every time there's an election, it becomes a love which dare not speak its name?
First Minister.
Well, can I firstly introduce Joanne Lamont to John Swinney? John Swinney, Joanne Lamont, John Swinney. Not apparently in exile. Unlike the Labour candidate in Aberdeen Donside, who after his first television interview, when he suggested he wanted the right to increase the council tax in Aberdeen, already the highest council tax in Scotland, was exiled from television interviews in case he repeated the gaffe. Can I just say to Joanne Lamont that the case for independence is articulated in terms of the economic progress and social justice that it will bring to the people of Scotland. Unfortunately, the Labour Party, in today of all days, this week of all weeks, is in no position to talk about social justice, since they're tearing up their opposition to the Tory party's welfare reforms, presumably so as Alistair Darling will feel more comfortable at the Tory conference this weekend. So no more something-for-nothing rhetoric from Joanne Lamont.
Joanne Lamont.
Well, that went down well. The fact of the matter is, that is an astonishing response from a First Minister who is to the right of George Osborne in giving cuts to big business.
Order.
The last time I
Order. There's far too much noise in the chamber.
The last time I noticed, the First Minister was still saying he would cut corporation tax 3 points more than George Osborne. And he's the only person unique in the whole of the United Kingdom who, on the one hand, is offering tax cuts and is saying we'll continue to spend the same way in public expenditure. It's simply not credible. It is not credible, and everyone knows it. But of course, the First Minister's campaign started with a day at the cinema. A year on, he's going to the zoo. But in our hearts, all of us know his campaign is going nowhere. You know, Scotland has a lot of sympathy for the panda, sweetie. We know what it is to reject the We know what it is to reject the unwanted advances of a big beast with only one thing on his mind. Because we also know this government has its priorities all wrong. That's why Mark MacDonald asked more questions in this Parliament about Japanese knotweed than A&E services in Aberdeen. And isn't that why the SNP won't mention independence in Aberdeen? Because the Yes campaign isn't helping Alex Salmond get his Yes man back into Holyrood.
First Minister.
It's better to do the punchline at the end of the question rather than the middle of the question. But can I read to Joanne Lamont? The worry is this is the top of a slippery slope towards US-type system of public services for the poor only. The attack on pensioners' allowances leaves a big question hovering over the future of the welfare state. Is it for everyone or just for the poor? That was Peter Hain this week. Not talking about the Tory government, talking about the Labour Party's change of policy. So in a week where even former cabinet ministers are openly doubting Labour's commitment to the welfare state, in a day when, as we're told in the Times, that Ed Miliband is going to repeat Joanne Lamont's rhetoric about a something-for-nothing society, I suppose we should be proud that Joanne Lamont is leading the Labour Party across the United Kingdom to the right. A something-for-nothing society. The whole onus of the SNP programme is a something-for-something society, to hold society together on universal benefits. The benefit to household incomes from the council tax fees, from free prescriptions, the benefit from students not having to pay tuition fees, the benefit on free personal care, the benefit on free transport. These are the policies which will win in Aberdeen and across Scotland.
Joanne Lamont.
That lecture would be a little more credible if he wasn't the last man standing arguing for Reaganomics in this country. And the fact of the matter is, when the First Minister talks about his fantastic spending programme, tell that to the college student that can't get a place. Tell that to the care worker who's got a 15-minute visit on task and go. And tell that to the pensioner who can't use a bus pass because there is no bus there at all. But the fact of the matter is, bizarrely, in Aberdeen, on the doorstep, he doesn't talk about the obsession that brought him into politics. When he's here, his ministers himself tell us what they cannot do till they have independence. But when they face real people, like the people of Aberdeen, they will speak about anything other than independence. Oh yes, I think you will find so, including your own candidate. Isn't that because he knows what the people of Scotland really think about his independence obsession? And perhaps that is the real reason he went to see the pandas at Edinburgh Zoo this week, to find out first-hand from Sunshine how to deal with rejection.
First Minister.
On the question of the Labour Party's commitment to Aberdeen, let me quote Gordon Matheson, Labour leader in the Evening Times 13th of December. They, that's the SNP, have given up in Glasgow and decided to concentrate the nation's resources on Aberdeen for the SNP. That is the Labour leader of Glasgow Council. Now, I know it's an embarrassment for Joanne Lamont for people in the North East of Scotland to be aware of the campaign that the Labour Party fronted to try and stop additional cash for the city of Aberdeen. That's a big embarrassment. Of course, it's an embarrassment to have a Labour candidate who wants to increase people's council tax. And of course, from the Labour Party's perspective, the new dental hospital in Aberdeen, the new emergency care centre, the green energy centre, the oil and gas academy centred in the city, these are embarrassments, but these are benefits that the Scottish National Party brought to the city of Aberdeen. But in terms of the embarrassment for the Labour Party across Scotland, moving on to the Tory ground on welfare policy, after 3 years of continually attacking it at Westminster, although following the example of the something-for-nothing rhetoric in this country, in this Parliament from Joanne Lamont, is a huge embarrassment for the Labour Party, as Peter Hain identified. And as far as students are concerned, we have a record number of students in higher education in Scotland. There is a collapse in student numbers in England. Why is there a collapse? Because of the policy of tuition fees south of the border, which Joanne Lamont says is the obvious thing to introduce in Scotland. And when these things are weighed in the balance, the excellent policies being pursued from Scotland, the things being imposed on us from Westminster, that is why people in Aberdeen and across Scotland will vote to mobilise this nation's resources and the social justice that will come from an independent Scotland.
Question number 2, Ruth Davidson. Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister when he will next meet the Prime Minister.
First Minister.
No plans, near future.
Ruth Davidson.
Thank you very much. Last week, I asked the First Minister if he would establish a public inquiry into the unfolding Baby Ashes scandal. In response, he replied that if I wanted to make the case for why a national public inquiry would benefit the bereaved parents, he would, of course, look at that. I wrote to him this week laying out that case. Presiding Officer, parents are calling for this and they're upset that they're not directly involved in Lord Bonamy's review. It has further emerged this week that crematoria workers involved in the disposal of their babies' remains will not be called to give evidence. Lord Bonamy's review will not give those who have suffered loss the answers that they need and deserve. Does the First Minister agree that in these circumstances the case for a public inquiry is now stronger than ever?
First Minister.
Can I say firstly to Ruth David, she wrote to me last night. I got her letter last night. It's dated the 5th of June, and I'll give it due consideration, as she would expect. But just on initially looking at her letter, 2 things. I see that she's corrected her position from last week when she suggested that parents weren't represented in the Bonamy Commission. In fact, both SANS and the Miscarriage Association as charities are represented on the Bonamy Commission. And she will remember, of course, it was a representative of SANS in Edinburgh who first brought this whole issue to light. So I don't think you can just dismiss these 2 important charities who are represented along with the other interests in the Bonamy Commission. Now, the Bonamy Commission has been established in order to take evidence with that broad-based panel in order that we can get the situation across Scotland into order as quickly as possible. He's reporting by the end of this year. It's about the future, it's about the best practice, about the things that should be done so we can have them, if necessary, into legislation to assure people that this sort of activity and this sort of grief for parents will not happen again. That's a really important thing. In terms of giving the parents the answers to their concerns, then of course that's what Ailish Angelini is doing in the independent inquiry in Edinburgh. There are audits that are taking place in the other places affected across Scotland. I have got the most enormous confidence in Dame Ailish Angelini, formerly the top law officer of Scotland. There is no evidence whatsoever that her inquiry is being hindered in any possible way at the present moment. But of course, when her inquiry comes forward and when we've got the proposals of the Bonamy Commission, then of course we'll look to make sure that everything has been done correctly and people's questions have been answered as they're entitled to do. But I hope that Ruth Davidson, now that she's had that information, will concede that the Bonamy Commission is indeed a broad-based commission. And secondly, the efforts that are being made are substantial in terms of giving parents answers, particularly in Edinburgh. And also the Bonamy Commission has been charged with the responsibility of sorting this position out for the whole of Scotland.
Thank you, Ruth Davidson.
I thank the First Minister for that answer, but what he doesn't appreciate is that neither the Bonamy Commission nor Dame Ailish's investigation is looking at individual cases and is looking at this in a historical perspective. And the people who are involved in this and are asking for answers are asking to find out what happened to the remains of their own children. They understand the time frame that is involved in a public inquiry. They understand that and they're asking for one anyway because they want answers as to what happened to them. This isn't a party political issue and it's not the Scottish Conservatives want to call for public inquiries lightly, and I know that the First Minister has listened before. Under him, his government has held 4 public inquiries, 2 of which are ongoing, one into hospital-acquired infections and another into contaminated blood products. So I am pressing the First Minister there are issues which are not covered by either Lord Bonamy's investigation or by Ailish Angelini's, which is looking primarily at Edinburgh. And on reflection, the First Minister must surely agree that this matter, which has caused so much distress to hundreds of families right across Scotland, not just in Edinburgh and the Lothians, should have the same kind of investigation on a similar scale as to public inquiries he set up in the past.
First Minister.
Well, I believe we can have confidence in Ailish Angelini's investigation as far as Edinburgh is concerned, and it will indeed try to get parents the answers that they desire. And I really do think we should, because the carry is underway and taking place. There is no evidence, because I've checked, that it's been blocked in any way by lack of information. And we should have confidence that Ailish Angelini will conduct that inquiry, as we know she can do and as she's demonstrated so many times in Scottish public life. If I could give Ruth Dason a point of detail, she did raise a concern with me in the letter last night about whether parents in Aberdeen would have the opportunity to make submissions to Lord Bonamy's report. I can confirm that they will do. The date that she believed was the date for finalising the audit in Aberdeen is actually the date for a council debate. The audit intends to be finalised by the end of this month, and Lord Bonamy's Commission will have the time and opportunity to take any submissions from parents in Aberdeen which come out of that audit. So I hope that gives her some reassurance. Now look, when Ailish Angelini has reported, when the Bonamy Commission has established for this Parliament the best practice that can quickly be introduced across Scotland to assure us that this sort of thing shall not happen again, then of course we'll weigh carefully if there are outstanding matters that require to be further investigated. But I do think that the balance of interest for parents, the balance of interest for society, is in allowing Ailish Angelini to go on with her work, allowing the Bonamy Commission to establish best practice across Scotland, and then weigh carefully and sensitively what's best to be done given that information.
Thank you. Regional supplementary from Rhoda Grant, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware that Judicial Review has ruled that the Scottish Government should have not stopped the Western Isles schools reorganisation. Will he now reimburse the Council for their lost savings and their legal fees in pursuing this review so that they can invest that in their community?
First Minister.
Well, I'm not quite certain where Rhoda Grant's going with this. I mean, the Scottish Government, in good faith, applied legislation because we were trying to establish that the correct procedures had been followed so that communities had the right and proper right to make submissions against school closures. The judgment as it is, and we are considering that judgment both in terms of how to react and also, secondly, in terms of whether improved legislation is needed to get that balance of interest between councils who are looking to close schools and the right of parents and others to object to that closure and be given the proper reference for doing so. I'm sure that Rhoda Grant would want parents to have that right. I'm sure she'll support legislation that ensures they have that right, and we'll consider the judgment from the court and take appropriate action accordingly.
Thank you, First Minister. Question number 3, Murdo Fraser.
Thank you. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's position is on how an independent Scotland would maintain research funding for universities. First
Minister.
Well, I have to say, university funding is not exactly the Conservative Party's strong suit today. In the Daily Telegraph yesterday, only yesterday, and I know Murdo Fraser reads it every day, I have to confess this article was pointed out to me. There was an extraordinary piece showing the financial pressure of universities in England as a result of the collapse in student numbers caused by the Conservative Party's policy on tuition fees. So in contrast, Scottish universities are in a strong financial position. And Scotland has maintained a world-leading position on research quality with 4 universities in the top 200. We are committed to maintaining that research funding and excellence in an independent Scotland. And of course, unlike his colleagues south of the border, we've demonstrated our commitment to university research. Most recently, we had an announcement just 2 weeks ago of an additional £13.7 million for key world-leading research.
Thank you. Murdo Fraser.
Within the UK, we currently have 8.5% of the population, but our universities win 15% of UK public and charitable research funding. A whole host of figures and bodies have expressed concern that this situation could be put at risk by independents, among them Professor David Bell, Stirling University, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, the Royal Society of Chemistry, and Professor Louise Richardson, Principal at St Andrews University, has said, if we were cut off from national research funding, it would be catastrophic for this institution. Without guarantees from the First Minister about the future funding of research in our universities, surely our academics would be better to conclude that we are better together.
First Minister.
Well, that's why I've just pointed out that this government is committed to university funding and to university research funding, unlike the Conservative Party south of the border. Incidentally, I'm very interested. I've got dozens of quotes from university principals south of the border saying what they think of the Westminster Government and the treatment of the universities. As Murdo Fraser alludes to, we contribute to the research funding. There's more research funding for universities, incidentally, comes from the Scottish Funding Council, and we contribute to the research funding from the various science councils. But can I just say to Murdo Fraser, he seems to be giving a one-sided view of these matters. Only in the 13th of April, well, one-sided view with the Conservatives and the Labour Party. I should say a two-sided view in the Better Together campaign. Only on the 13th of April in the Times, Professor Tim O'Shea, one of the most successful universities, University of Edinburgh, asked this very question, said there was no reason why any form of constitutional change should preclude participation in higher-order research councils, which, of course, research grants are made on the basis of merit, as they will continue to be so, backed by the Scottish Government. I would think it would be virtually impossible for the Conservative Party to find a single university principal in the whole of England who would tell them that universities are being properly funded under the tutelage of the Conservative Party. Where university finances, let me repeat, according to that prime source, the Daily Telegraph, are collapsing, and when student numbers have been in freefall as a result of the student fee policy. And I merely mention these things to warn the Labour Party that their association with this lot is going to cost them dear.
Briefly, please, Linda Fabiani.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the First Minister agree that not only would Scotland's universities continue to be world-class in an independent Scotland, but that they would no longer face the threat posed by Westminster's damaging student visa policies, which have been described by the Scottish Council for Development and Industry as a huge challenge to universities socially and financially, and to Scotland economically?
First Minister.
Well, of course, I do agree with that, and that's why I gave the assurance. I do agree with the university principals who say that English universities, and indeed universities across Europe, would kill for the funding settlement given by this government to Scotland's universities. But quite rightly, they point to the evidence from the Scottish Council for Development and Industry, who, in their evidence to the Education Committee on the 2nd of October, drew attention to another Tory Labour Liberal threat to our university system, and that, of course, is the student visa policy. They said that the biggest source of concern for research in Scotland was Westminster's tightening of student visas. They said that student visas, quote, is a huge challenge to universities socially and financially, and to Scotland economically. I agree with that. I think it's high time that the No campaign got someone who is prepared to speak up for the real interests of Scottish universities.
Very briefly, Liam MacArthur.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Royal Society of Edinburgh and the Royal Society of Chemistry have questioned whether universities in an independent Scotland will be able to access Research Council, charitable and EU funding. Does the First Minister believe that these bodies are guilty of scaremongering?
First Minister.
No, but I certainly think the constituency MSP is, given his mention of EU research funding. Has it not occurred to him, incidentally, the scientific advisor to the European Commission is the former Scottish scientific advisor at the present moment, giving an indication that we are actually well integrated into scientific research across the European Union. But I thought even for the constituency member, it would be dawning on him that the threat to Scotland's position in Europe doesn't come from these benches, it comes from his colleagues in the benches at Westminster. The way to preserve Scotland's position in Europe and access to research funding is for an independent Scotland, not be taken into an in-out referendum dragged by its coalition partners in London.
Question number 4, Kenneth Gibson.
To ask the First Minister what impact the UK Government's proposed spending reductions for 2015-16 will have on the Scottish Government's budget.
First Minister.
Well, we won't know the full impact of the Chancellor's budget cuts until the 26th of June. However, we do know that he set a target of a further retrenchment, a further austerity of £11.5 billion from the resource budget in 2015-2016. The Scottish Government will continue to press the UK Government to take a different approach and instead outline a clear package of proposals to invest in jobs and growth. And I hope even the Conservative, Liberal and Labour members in this chamber can see the eminent common sense in that switch of policy, as opposed to the continuation of the austerity squeeze from Westminster.
Kenneth Gibson.
I thank the First Minister for his reply. Yesterday, Ernst & Young published their annual Foreign Direct Investment Survey, which shows Scotland has a sparkling investment performance and there is no sign of investors being deterred from coming to Scotland by the independence referendum. If anything, the reverse appears to be true. Yet he will know that the Institute of Fiscal Studies informed the Finance Committee that by 2018 the standard of living, if we remain in the UK, will be lower than it was in 2001. Does the First Minister agree that the gains made for Scotland by his government are now at the mercy of Westminster's austerity agenda, which Shadow Chancellor Ed Balls admitted on Monday would lead to even deeper cuts should Labour return to power, with Ed Miliband confirming only today he would end universal benefits, and that the only way to secure prosperity and social justice for Scotland is with independence through a resounding yes vote next year?
First Minister.
I thought it would be a fair calculation today that the words inward investment would not be mentioned either from the Conservative or indeed the Labour benches, or the Labour benches and the Conservative benches, whichever way round it is these days. Given both Joanne Lamont and Ruth Davidson have previously said that investors are being scared away from Scotland because of the independence referendum. But of course the person who said this most often is the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne. A year past November, he said he knew of investors who are being scared away from Scotland. Now we have the best performance in 15 years, a sparkling performance as indicated by Ernst & Young. Perhaps we could get a collective apology from Bitter Together about their unfounded scaremongering exposed in front of the Scottish people.
Question number 5, Jackie Baillie.
To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's position is on recruitment and retention payments paid to senior management at the State Hospital.
First Minister.
Well, the recruitment and retention premium for staff at the State Hospital under the Agenda for Change Terms and Conditions were put in place on the 24th of June 2005 by the Scottish Pay Reference and Implementation Group, operating under delegated authority from the then Scottish Executive Ministers. That premium applies to staff who have ongoing access to the State Hospital's secure environment, recognising the unique and challenging environment of working at the State Hospital. The terms and conditions for State Hospital senior managers were published on 18 October 2006 and make clear that unless specified otherwise, that managers are also covered by Agenda for Change terms, which would definitely, apparently, include the retention premium.
Jackie Baillie.
Can I thank the First Minister for his response and encourage him to read all of the letter from the Scottish Pay Reference and Implementation Group of the 24th of June 2005, which he quoted from, because that makes clear that senior staff in the State Hospital are not part of the Agenda for Change pay scales. Senior staff do not qualify for the special payment that applies only to frontline staff, yet all of these senior staff at the State Hospital got an extra £7,000 backdated to 2005, and this at a time when pay was frozen for everybody else. Does he share my anger that senior staff have taken it upon themselves to pay themselves more money without knowledge or sign-off by the Cabinet Secretary, which they are required to do? And will he therefore ensure that the matter is investigated independently of the State Hospital?
First Minister.
Well, I wish Jackie Baillie had listened to the answer, because if she had done so, she would have heard it's not just the 24th of June 2005 Agenda for Change Terms and Conditions. It's the Terms and Conditions for State Hospital Senior Managers published on the 18th of October 2006. These are the ones that make it clear that unless specified otherwise, the managers are also covered by Agenda for Change terms, which would include the retention premium. That is the suggestion and the position that the civil service have looked at and come up with in terms of the position. Now, if that is correct, then Jackie Baillie will have noticed in terms of 2005 and the 18th of October 2006 that this is following the contractual obligations. If that is the case, then she's not seriously suggesting that with contractual obligations, particularly those which were negotiated in the term of the last Labour-Liberal government, should not be followed through. And therefore, I think Jackie Baillie should consider whether or not it's wise to impugn the integrity of people at the State Hospital, given the indications which have been provided by the civil service in terms that they were following the rules as laid down by the last Labour-Liberal administration.
Question number 6, Jim Eadie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what steps the Scottish Government is taking to improve treatment for people with dementia.
First Minister.
Well, on Monday this week at Alzheimer's Scotland's Dementia Connections Conference, we launched our second three-year national dementia strategy. The new strategy will further improve diagnosis rates, transform the quality of post-diagnostic support and take forward a national action plan on improving hospital care for people with dementia.
Jim Eadie.
Thank the First Minister for that answer. Does he agree that although Scotland has the best early diagnosis figures in the United Kingdom, there must continue to be a focus on improving post-diagnosis treatment, particularly in acute hospitals, so that those people living with dementia and their families can have the support which they are quite rightly entitled to receive at what can often be a difficult time?
First Minister.
Well, diagnosis is the key that unlocks support for people with dementia and their families. Scotland has a good record on that front, with 64% of people with dementia being diagnosed up to March 2012, compared with much lesser percentages elsewhere. That dementia commitment, which has been described as a world first by Alzheimer's Scotland, includes the guarantee that everyone diagnosed on the 1st of April this year is entitled to a named support worker for a minimum of a year to help them and their families understand the illness, manage its symptoms and plan for future care. Now, the new three-year National Action Plan on improving care for people with dementia in hospitals was announced last month. Supporting that, Alzheimer's Scotland dementia nurse consultants have been appointed to boards across Scotland, and over 300 dementia champions are now in place. And given the nature of this subject and the fact that I suspect that every single person in this chamber has personal awareness of people suffering from dementia, I think that progress, that much-needed progress, should be widely welcomed.
Briefly, Jane Baxter.
Thank you. A Freedom of Information request has revealed that in 2011, a patient with dementia was subjected to 13 bed or ward moves during a single stay in an NHS 5 hospital. Will the First Minister agree with me that this is unacceptable? And will he give an assurance that, under his improvements, such high levels of moves for a single patient will not happen again?
Thank you. First Minister.
I think that is unacceptable, and I'll certainly have the Health Secretary look into the case. Can I say, on a subject like this, that a specific example, a notification of that example, and then I would like to be able to give the member a comprehensive reply. And if she would come forward on that basis now to the Health Secretary, then he'll certainly do it. But what she described is certainly unacceptable, and hopefully the changes that are being made will make the chances of it happening again much less likely.
Thank you, First Minister. That concludes questions to the First Minister, and we now move to the next item of business. Could I ask members who are leaving the chamber to do so quickly and quietly, please? Could I also ask guests who are leaving the gallery to also do so